Well, top of the morning for MrHeartlight. Back here on the 4 o'clock bench. But it's a little earlier in the day. It's about 10 degrees. But this is a special report. It's Groundhog's Day, you know. Well, I know all about Groundhog's Day. It's held in Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania. I've been out there. There's some good friends out there, the Gigliottis. And I've spent some time seeing where Phil does his thing and where tens of thousands of people descend on this little town of Punxsutawney just to see Phil come out and see his bloody shadow at about 7:30 this morning. Well, Phil came out, a little cloudy. He did, but he did see his shadow. There was enough light that cast a shadow, just like I'm casting a shadow here. So it means when it's cold and clear, that when Phil emerges from the ground at that sunrise, and he sees his shadow, that we'll have 6 more weeks of winter. Well, if he doesn't see his shadow, we'll have an early spring. But that's only happened 17 times in the past 120 years. 111 times Phil had forecasted a longer winter. So out of all those times, there wasn't that many early springs, and we don't really have them. So actually, Phil is about 80% right on his forecasts. And it actually goes back, it's not just Phil, it goes back to the Druids, way back ancient pagan, to today is February 2nd. It's the midpoint between the spring solstice and the winter solstice. So we're halfway through winter. So that's a good thing. We're working our way towards spring. And although you may be familiar with Punxsutawney Phil, I bet a lot of you are familiar with the movie Groundhog's Day with Bill Murray. I've often, when I spoke onto grief groups, I've talked about, especially in those early years, how our grief is like Groundhog's Day, if you've seen the movie. Where he wakes up, Bill Murray wakes up every morning and it's the same damn day, every day. And it's like that in our grief. Especially in those early years, we go to bed hurting and dreaming and not wanting to sleep because of the bad dreams, and wanting to sleep because we want connection dreams. It's just so hard to sleep and we become exhausted. But then when you wake up in the morning, you go, oh geez, it's another day. It's true, they're dead. We wake up every morning, the first thought we have is our loved one is dead. And that's like Groundhog's Day. Every single day you wake up at another challenge to survive. But eventually, like with Punxsutawney Phil, spring does come, the shadows do lift. So in order to cast a shadow though, we have to have light. So we know about Phil seeing his shadow. But around the same time that Punxsutawney Phil started forecasting over 100 years ago, another man named J.M. Barrie wrote a children's book that you might be familiar with. At that same time, it has to do with a shadow. Can you guess? Who was looking for their shadow? Ah, you're right, Peter Pan. So Peter Pan is a story that J.M. Barrie wrote because he's a bereaved sibling. There's a very, very good book out called The Replacement Children, The Unconscious Script by Rita Silverman. It's a wonderful book. Pretty new, and it's got a foreword by Katie Couric, and the last chapter by yours truly, including a story about being a replacement child. Not so much being a replacement child, but being in the shadow of the death of a sibling is where I put some input and, well, I'm getting off topic. I want to get back to Mr. Barry, who wrote Peter Pan. He was 6 years old when his little brother, or his big brother rather, of 13, 14 years old, slipped on the ice skating and cracked his skull and died. It was his mother's favorite, his brother. And so at night he would hear his mother calling for his brother. So young Mr. Barry would go into the room in the dark and say and talk back to his mother, as though it was his brother. He assumed the role of his brother. He dressed like his brother. It made his mother happy, so he assumed that role. He became his dead brother. In fact, even at age 14, the same age as when his brother died, Mr. Barry quit growing. He died under 5 feet. He was a small man. And there's some truth to that. It's not that he's trying to be his brother physically. We're in intense grief and traumatic grief. As a child, it can stunt their growth. There's evidence in studies that show that the stress of grief can actually stunt a child's growth. So we look at the Peter Pan story, and actually the Mr. Barry later on married a woman with a bunch of kids. He didn't have children of his own. He was a child of his own. He really never did grow up. He was always a child. But he loved children. So kind of like in a Michael Jackson way, he just liked to be around children. And he met these boys in the park. It sounds horrible, but he's just a kid. He met them and then met their mother, fell in love with the mother, and married them. And one of the boys' name was Peter, one was Michael, and so he named a lot of the characters after some of the characters that are the real life people. In fact, Peter Barry, he later adopted them after their mother died. So Peter Barry, as an adult, threw himself under a train. He was very traumatized by everybody calling him Peter Pan. Little factoid that you didn't know. But Peter Pan's always looking for his shadow. He's looking for his older brother. That's what the whole story is about. His shadow is missing. He was in the shadow of his older brother, and now that shadow is gone. And so he goes into Never Never Land and never wanting to grow up, always wanting to be a boy. And so a lot of this whole story was based on truth, on his trying to find joy in his grief and his fantasy world. And even Tinkerbell was that, like the fairy connection, the connection with spirit, and magic and magical thinking, that he could escape his grief with magical thinking. And sometimes we can tend to do that, but reality creeps in, and it's not a fairy tale, it's not a story, it's real life. So if you feel like you're in the shadow of your despair, reach out to others who have also lost their shadow, and together we'll find the light. Turn on your hot light.